The call came at 11:58 a.m. on November 13, 2022. 4 University of Idaho students, brutally murdered in their sleep. What police didn't know was that somewhere in the darkness of that November morning, a criminology PhD student was potentially putting theory into deadly practice. This is Moscow, Idaho. Population 25,000. A college town where the most serious crime is usually underage drinking. But on King Road, in a white rental house overlooking the Palace Hills, something unspeakable had occurred. 4 young lives, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Madison Mogan, and Kaylee Goncalves, cut short by an unknown killer who vanished into the night. Their futures, their dreams, all stolen in moments of unthinkable violence. The house at 1122 King Road stood like any other student rental. 3 stories of cramped bedrooms and shared spaces where 6 roommates lived the typical college experience. Kaylee and Madison, best friends since 6th grade, shared the 3rd floor. Xana lived on the 2nd floor with her boyfriend Ethan, who was visiting that night. 2 other roommates occupied the 1st floor, unaware that above them, a nightmare was unfolding. November 12 began like any other Saturday. Kaylee and Madison spent the evening at a local sports bar, captured on surveillance cameras laughing and socializing. They returned home around 1:45 a.m., ordering food from a local truck, their last meal together. Xana and Ethan had been at a fraternity party, arriving home around the same time. By 2 a.m., the house had settled into quiet. What happened next would haunt Moscow forever. The calm before an unimaginable storm of violence would descend upon the sleeping students. Sometime between 3 and 4 a.m., an intruder entered the house. Armed with a large fixed-blade knife, they moved through the darkness with calculated precision. The attack was swift, silent, and devastating. 4 victims, multiple stab wounds each, killed in their beds. 2 roommates on the 1st floor slept through it all, unaware of the horror above. The surviving roommates didn't call police until nearly noon the next day. When officers arrived at the scene, they found carnage that would shake even seasoned investigators. Blood had seeped through walls and floors. The killer had left no obvious evidence. No fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon. It was as if they understood exactly how to avoid detection. Detective Brett Payne surveyed the scene with growing unease. In 20 years of law enforcement, he'd never seen such a methodical attack. The killer had navigated the house in complete darkness, knew exactly where to strike. Days turned into weeks. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing behavioral analysts and forensic experts. They processed over 4,000 tips, conducted hundreds of interviews, collected mountains of evidence. But the killer remained a ghost. Moscow lived in terror, students fled campus, parents demanded answers that investigators simply didn't have. The community was gripped by fear and uncertainty. Then came the breakthrough. On November 29, investigators announced they were searching for a white Hyundai Elantra seen near the scene around the time of the murders. It was their first real lead in a case that had produced few clues. Somewhere, the driver of that car held the key to 4 brutal murders. The investigation had finally found direction. 2,500 miles away in Pennsylvania, Brian Koberger was finishing his final semester as a criminology PhD student at Washington State University. His dissertation focused on criminal psychology and forensic investigation techniques. He'd spent years studying how killers think, how they plan, how they evade capture. Now, those very skills might have served a darker purpose than academic research. Koberger had always been fascinated by murder. Fellow students remembered his intense interest in violent crime, his detailed questions about investigative procedures, his unsettling demeanor during class discussions. He'd applied to multiple PhD programs, seeking to understand the criminal mind. But perhaps he'd learned too much about the very subject he claimed to study academically. On December 15, Kohberger drove his white Hyundai Elantra cross-country to his parents' home in Pennsylvania. It should have been a routine trip home for the holidays. Instead, it may have been an attempt to distance himself from the scene of 4 murders. FBI agents were already tracking his movements, analyzing cell phone data, building a case. The net was tightening. Investigators had discovered that Kohberger's phone had pinged cell towers near the King Road house multiple times before the murders, a pattern of surveillance that chilled investigators. He'd been watching, planning, perhaps even practicing his approach to the house where 4 students lived their final weeks in complete ignorance of the danger lurking nearby. On December 30, Pennsylvania State Police surrounded the Kohberger family home in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside, they found Brian Kohberger sleeping peacefully, unaware that months of investigation had finally led to his doorstep. The arrest was swift and silent. Nothing like the violent chaos he allegedly unleashed in Moscow 7 weeks earlier. Justice had finally caught up with the suspected killer. The evidence against Kohberger began mounting immediately. His white Elantra matched witness descriptions. His cell phone data placed him near the murder scene repeatedly. Most damning, investigators found his DNA on a knife sheath left at the crime scene, a crucial mistake that connected the criminology student to 4 brutal murders. But this was just the beginning of a mystery that would grow more disturbing with each revelation. Kohberger hadn't just studied criminal behavior. He'd allegedly conducted surveys asking convicted felons about their crimes. He'd spent years learning how killers think, and now he stood accused of becoming one himself. The student had potentially become the subject of his own research. The irony was inescapable. A man who dedicated his academic career to understanding criminal minds now faced charges for the very crimes he studied. Had his research been preparation? Had years of analyzing violent behavior taught him how to kill without leaving evidence? The questions haunted everyone who knew him and challenged everything they believed about academic pursuit. As Kohberger awaited extradition to Idaho, investigators continued building their case. They analyzed hours of surveillance footage, processed hundreds of pieces of evidence, interviewed anyone who'd ever crossed paths with the suspect. What emerged was a portrait of a man obsessed with violence, possibly driven to transform academic theory into deadly reality. The line between studying evil and becoming evil had allegedly been crossed. The families of the victims watched in anguish as their children's alleged killer sat in a jail cell, protected by the same legal system he'd studied so intensively. Kaylee's father spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. Madison's mother clutched photos of her daughter's smile. Xana and Ethan's families struggled to understand how their children's joy had been extinguished. Moscow, Idaho, would never be the same. The small college town that prided itself on safety had become synonymous with unspeakable tragedy. Students walked in groups, parents installed security systems. Everyone wondered if they truly knew their neighbors. The King Road house stood empty, a monument to violence that shattered a community's innocence forever. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that evil can hide behind academic credentials and scholarly pursuits. If Kohberger was indeed the killer, he'd used his education not to prevent crime, but to perfect it. He'd studied the system not to serve justice, but to evade it. The very knowledge meant to protect society had potentially been weaponized against 4 innocent students. As Kohberger's trial approaches, questions linger about the intersection of knowledge and evil. Can studying violence create killers? Does understanding criminal behavior inevitably lead some to cross that line themselves? The Idaho student murders may represent the ultimate perversion of education, a PhD student who learned too much about murder and possibly decided to conduct the most horrific research of all. In the end, Brian Koberger's greatest lesson may be this: sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who understand exactly how the hunt should unfold. 4 families will never be whole again, and a small Idaho town learned that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places, even the halls of higher learning, where knowledge became a weapon, and a criminology student allegedly became the very monster he claimed to study. The student had become the subject, and the lesson was written in blood.